Yeah.
Good. Computer's working. All right. Women.
Yeah.
They make up slightly more than 50% of the population, whether it's Jewish or non-Jewish. And much of what we have talked about throughout all of the last 33 classes applies equally to men and women. However, as you probably also know, there have been some differences over the last 2,000-3,000 years in different communities, screensaver, in different communities about how women participated, about how women were active in the community. And so that has created, in the modern world, some big differences, for example, between the way the Orthodox treat women and the way the conservative movement treats women. And because we're the conservative movement, our decisions about how we treat women are not just because we feel like it. It is rooted in the tradition. So we're going to go through a number of different topics that are of particular interest regarding women or women's issues. And I will outline the conservative movement's position and where we have that position rooted in the tradition. We're good? Okay. So, first of all, you have to understand what we mean when we talk about egalitarianism, right? A very famous, a very popular word that gets thrown around a lot, right? Egalitarianism is technically the desire for equality, right? You want things to be equal, right? Egalitarianism, that same root, I believe. And it is an inspiration, right? People have a gut feeling in the modern world that equality would be good. But according to halakha, Jewish law, right, just because you want it to be equal doesn't make it so. Let me give you an example that has nothing to do with men or women, but where there is no egalitarianism, right? I am not a Kohen. I will never be a Kohen, right? Because my father wasn't a Kohen. Kohanim get to do some things and have certain restrictions that I don't, right? So I have certain freedoms. I can go to a cemetery and not worry about my status. A Kohen cannot. Kohens have the privileges of being able to do certain blessings that I cannot. Right? So there are differences. We are not equal. Now, equal doesn't mean they're better and I'm worse, or I'm better, they're worse. Someone coming?
Yes.
Oh, dear. We even tried to give a pause, but
that word, the Jewish law, is that
halakha. Halakha.
This is the Kohen at the Kohen Gadol.
The high priest. Yes.
Exactly.
But we don't have any. But we don't have any of those.
Aaron.
Yes, Aaron was the first Kohen. Exactly. So it's not that I'm better than them or they're better than me, but there is a difference between the two groups. And that's also true for the Levi'im. So equality as being the same is not something that Judaism demands. And there are parts of Jewish law that are not going to be 100% equal. But that still being said, when we look at each section of halakha that pertains to women and men, then we decide it according to its own merits, its own ideas. When the conservative movement began talking about, can women read Torah? Can women lead services? Can women be rabbis? We didn't just say, we want them to be rabbis. We want them to read Torah. We didn't say, well, if they can do one, they can do all the others. We looked at each of the different topics in its own way. And decided each one in its own way. So egalitarian may encourage us to weigh one interpretation more heavily than another, but it cannot create precedent where there is none. Meaning, if the Torah had simply said women can't do something, then the conservative movement would still follow exactly what the Torah said. But if there is room for understanding or interpretation, then we do have the right to interpret it as we think is appropriate for our community. You following so far?
Yes.
We're going to go through some examples, don't worry. So thankfully, despite the rhetoric and customs of recent centuries, antiquity, all the ancient world, provides ample and legitimate precedent for equal treatment of women in the 5 areas of prayer, of leadership, of minyan, of Torah reading, of being a witness, and of ordination, becoming rabbis. Now I'm not going to go through all of those tonight, because that's like a whole semester at college. But we're going to go through some of the issues that are surrounding these topics, or some of these topics, and a few other issues that sometimes come up around women that I think need clearing up, because sometimes you will hear rabbis, usually from the Orthodox world, who will say things and they will act like this is from Moses. And it's not from Moses. It's from the last couple hundred years, or maybe 300 or 400 years, but it's not all the way back to the beginning. And that is something we need to remember. We're good?
Yes.
Okay. So let's talk about one of the most important principles in why there was a distinction, why there was a difference between men and women going all the way back for 2,000 years. And it's based around the idea that in Judaism, in order to have the opportunity for leadership in particular, you need to have an obligation. Let me explain. A deaf mute, a lunatic, and a minor cannot perform a religious duty on behalf of the congregation. Why not? Well, this is the principle. One who is not under obligation to perform the religious duty cannot perform it on behalf of the congregation. So let's take, for example, my son, Nathaniel. Right? He's 10 years old, so he's a minor. He's a child. Right now, the community and God does not expect him to do the Amidah, to do the tefillah, the prayer, each day. Now, am I trying to teach him to do this? Of course. But if he misses a day, he's a kid. He is off the hook because he is just a kid. Right? He is still learning. And that's what we believe for all commandments. But if I put him on the bima and I say, okay, lead Shacharit, lead the morning service, it doesn't work, right? Because he doesn't have the obligation, he cannot be our representative, right? Only a person who is doing it because of an equal duty compared to everyone else in the community can be a representative of the community. So what we have to do is establish, is there a duty for women? Because if not, then they can't lead. We see the difference here? Right? So we have to have an obligation in order to understand. We're good? Maybe. We'll see. All right. So the Shema and Tefillah, that is to say the saying of the Shema and the saying of the Amidah, these are two issues that are often talked about as, do women have an obligation or do they not? Right. Women and slaves and minors, children, are exempt from the recitation of the Shema and from the obligation of wearing phylacteries, the fancy word for tefillin, right, on the arm and on the head, but are obligated to recite the prayer, the Amidah, and the mezuzah, put up a mezuzah, and to recite the grace after meals, Birkat HaMazon. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, women, slaves, and minors are exempt. Exempt doesn't mean they were never obligated. Exempt means they had an obligation which has been currently canceled, right? So 2,000 years ago, women, of course, had the obligation, but because of who they were and who slaves were and who children were, there was a special get out of jail free card, right? They were off the hook because all three of these were either too young or too obligated to some other human being, right? For most of our history, women had obligations to their husband that they had to follow, right? If the husband says, I want you out milking the cow at 5 a.m, for most of our history, men had the authority and had the economic power to make his wife or children do whatever he felt like, right? This doesn't mean that he was supposed to behave that way, but he could. And that meant, our sages said, therefore women, if you give them the obligation, they would have to choose between serving God and serving their husband. And that doesn't make for a very happy house, right? Because now you're causing strife and tension between husband and wife. So women, they were let off the hook for the Shema. Why the Shema? Because the Shema needed to be done at a very particular time. And therefore, maybe that was the time that she had another duty. Whereas the Tefillah or the Mezuzah or doing Birkat HaMazon, the blessing we do after we eat, that has a bigger window of time that goes along with it. We'll go into that topic in a little more detail. Right, so according to Brachot, the Talmud, right, why is it that women were not doing the Shema? Why were they exempt at this time? Well, it is self-evident, since it is a positive time-bound mitzvah. And from such mitzvot, women are exempt. So what is a positive time-bound commandment. It means it's a commandment where God says, you must do da, 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 right? You must do this thing. And you must do it at this specific time. Right? Those were the two categories, or the two, conditions that were used to give women an exemption. Because it was something they had to do at a certain time, and because of the economic and societal structure of their obligations to their family, women were therefore exempt for that type of commandment. For all other commandments, everybody already knew they had a full obligation, right? So it's not like women can murder, because that says don't murder. That is a negative commandment. It's not like women can eat pork, because it's don't eat pork. And it's like the mezuzah. It's not like you have to put a mezuzah on in the first hour of the day, right? You can put a mezuzah on anytime during the day. So there's a much bigger window, and therefore women, of course, still have that obligation. Following the logic so far? Okay. So what might you have said? Since in the recitation of the Shema is the act of accepting the dominion of heaven, we are accepting that God is our God, they might be obligated to recite Shema. So we are informed that it is not the case. So what they're trying to say is, you might have thought, since the contents of the Shema is so important, that we would have left women obligated to at least do that. So we had to say they're not obligated to clear up that possible confusion. It's the way the rabbinic texts talk, right? The reason we said it was to avoid you getting the wrong impression, because you might have thought it was something else for this very good reason, but it's not. It's like we said it was. You get used to that, you'll be much happier when you're reading rabbinic texts. But it takes a while to get your brain around that idea of, we had to tell you this to rule out another idea. Good. So, but they are obligated to recite the prayer, the Amidah, tefillah, right? The main prayer that we do at Shacharit, that we do at Musaf, we do at Mincha, we do at Mariv. Here, for example, on Shabbat morning, it's the part that begins with the melody, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu v'Elohei avoteinu. Right? That is the beginning of the Amidah when we do it out loud on a Shabbat. We use different melodies for other times. So why are women obligated for that? Because the prayer involves beseeching God's mercy, right? That because we are saying that we need God to help us, that is something that both men and women have to do, right? That is their obligation. Now, what might you have thought? Since it is written in connection with the prayer evening and morning and at noontime, taken from Psalms 55, the matter at hand is a positive time-bound mitzvah. So we are informed that it is not the case. All right, now if you're confused, excellent. Because what you're seeing here is that the rabbis were trying to understand and apply the sense of obligation in a way that is not 100% crystal clear, self-obvious, and agreed by everyone who would read this, right? Some people might say the obligation of Shema should be universal, and so they had to say it wasn't. And some people might say the obligation for doing the Amidah is time-bound, and so therefore women shouldn't have to do it, so they had to tell you that it was. So this is trying to point out that it's not clear, it's not easy to figure out what women had to do, what women didn't have to do, and in fact, the rabbis had to explain it on a case, and that means they had to explain why in that case and why not in others. It also meant that if their explanation, if their reason was based on some condition from their time period or their situation, if that condition or that situation changes, then so can the obligation. So in the modern world, where women are equal to men in their business, women are equal to men under the law, women do not have to worry about their husbands giving them orders and things like that, women are freer, and therefore they have more responsibilities, right? If you're less obligated to your husband, you have more obligations to God. Right? It's not like you, I don't have to do what my husband says, and I don't have to do what God says. No. The only reason that Judaism did not make you always do what God wanted everybody to do was because of your husband. And now, without him, go for it, right? You are free. Okay. So, tefillah, just to make sure that we understand the Amidah, we can see this even in Rambam, in his Laws of Prayer, in his Mishnah Torah, right? Chapter 1, right at the beginning. To pray daily is a positive commandment, as it says, and you shall serve the Lord your God, Exodus 23. According to tradition, the service that is here referred to is prayer, right? Because there's lots of different ways to talk about what does service mean. Maybe it means sacrifice, and maybe it means a donation of something. No, according to our tradition, that means prayer. As it is said, and serve him with all your heart, from Deuteronomy, on which the sages commented, what may be described as service of the heart? Prayer. Right? Service of the heart is clearly not sacrificing an animal. Service of the heart is clearly not dropping off cash. Service of the heart is prayer. So the number of prayers is not prescribed in the Torah. The Torah itself doesn't tell us 3 times a day. The Torah just tells us pray. No form of prayer is prescribed in the Torah, right? The beautiful avot, Baruch atah Adonai, right? The Torah never has a quote of exactly that blessing, right? The Torah doesn't tell us exactly how to pray. It just tells us we need to pray. Nor does the Torah tell us what time we are supposed to pray, right? It kind of gives us a feeling that it should be all, different times of the day, but the Torah never says pray in the morning, pray in the afternoon, pray in the evening. So if you're getting a feel for this, you're beginning to understand why women still have this obligation, right? Hence, women and slaves are under obligation to pray, since this is not a time-bound positive mitzvah. The obligation in this precept is that each person should daily, according to his ability or hers, offer up supplication, offer up a request and prayer to God. First, uttering praises of God. That says cod. First, uttering praises of God. Cod is a type of fish. It's good fish, but it's not God. Then, with humble supplication and petition, ask for all that he or she needs. And finally, offer praise and thanksgiving to the Eternal for the benefits already bestowed upon him or her in rich measure. Okay, so, question.
So if it's not in the Torah, the specifics, where is it then? In the Talmud?
So it's found in the Midrash and in the Mishnah and in the Talmud, right? That's the rabbis add different things. But even then, if you go into the Talmud and you try to look up the Amidah and you want to look up the text of the prayer, you're not going to find every single word that we do in our Siddur, because much of that was improvised. It was extemporaneous. The person who was leading the service would form the sentences as they were feeling moved at that moment. But over time, we have discovered most people aren't really good at knowing what to say to God. Right? Most people don't even know what to say to their friend. Right? So the Siddur was built as a book out of people writing down, this way of talking about this idea works. This way is a good way to talk about the most important parts of this concept. And over time, the key concepts, which are in the Mishnah and the Talmud, the key concepts built up a whole little paragraph around them of words that we like. Now, that's why you'll find differences between the Ashkenazic, the Sephardic, and the Hasidic Siddurim, because they edited to fit their own preferences.
Question, is there really a special time for prayer, or does it matter?
Oh, so yes and no. So from the Torah, there is no specific time that you have to do the prayer. But the rabbis said that you should do a prayer in the morning, a prayer in the afternoon, and a prayer in the evening, right? And an additional one, Musaf, when it's Shabbat and a holiday. So the Torah itself does not put down exactly what time, but we realized that praying 3 times a day was really a great way to make sure you did this mitzvah.
Is there a position that you have to kneel or stand?
Nope. For the Amidah, we do while standing. For this prayer, we always do it while standing. And of course, we usually, if we can, face towards Jerusalem.
Yeah, question. I think I have read, and I have the type of Siddur. I wear Siddur
Right.
Our congregation, but then I used to have the Chabad.
Right.
Okay? And I have read, I think in both, it is saying that we have to pray the Shema in the day and
Yes.
the evening.
Right. So the Shema is 2 times a
2
day.
times a day.
The Amidah is 3 times a day.
2 times a day, okay.
Exactly.
So, but, you know,
Which is why mincha is a much shorter service.
okay, I got you, but it doesn't matter, women also can pray the Shema.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. It
Absolutely.
doesn't matter if it's in the morning or in the evening.
Correct. And should in both the morning and the evening.
Uh-huh,
Exactly.
uh-huh.
So
That's a mitzvah.
right. So in the conservative movement, we believe this is a mitzvah that both men and women should be doing at all of the normal times of doing it. Morning, evening, afternoon, musaf extra. It should be done by everyone. And because it's an obligation, that means a woman can lead services. Right? So that's why you'll know we have many women who lead our services who are excellent at doing so. Okay, so now we have another topic, which is called the Torah, right? Because reading from the Torah is a different mitzvah. It is a different part of the community. And we're going to walk through why women are allowed to read from the Torah. Because if you go to an Orthodox synagogue, you will never see a woman reading from the Torah. Okay, so we'll talk about why that is and why we do. So first of all, does everybody need to know the Torah? Of course. Deuteronomy 31. Gather, right? Hakel, right? Gather them together. The word kehila comes from that same, meaning the community. Gather all the people, men, women, children, strangers, that they may hear and learn to revere the Lord your God. Right, so this idea of gathering is clearly meant to bring everybody together. As Magen Avraham, one of the great commentators, puts it, a woman is obligated to hear the reading of the Torah. Right? So maybe a woman wants to stay home on Saturday morning and doesn't want to come and hear the Torah read. No, right? It is an obligation for a woman to hear the Torah being read. If you're sick or whatever, fine. But or if there's a hurricane coming, stay home. But if it's a normal day, then both men and women should be coming to hear the Torah be read. Right? And even though the reading was ordained, it was set up for the purpose of Torah study, and women are not bound by the commandment of Torah study, again, because of the time restrictions, it is nevertheless a commandment to listen, just like the commandment of Hakel, to gather, which is binding on the women. Right? So if women have to come to hear Moses, women also have to come hear the book of Moses, meaning the Torah. Following so far? Okay. But we may say that even though they are not obligated, they are still counted toward the number, right? Even though their obligation is a little different, that women should still count towards the number of people that are hearing the Torah. And it is stated in the Tosafot, which were during the Middle Ages, they were a very important group of commentators, at the conclusion of Rosh Hashanah. But in Masechet Sofrim in 19, it is written, women are under the obligation to listen to the reading of the Torah, the same as men, and it is a commandment to translate for them so they understand. Meaning that if the Torah was being read in Hebrew and the women did not know Hebrew, you had to have somebody who would translate it into whatever language they needed. You couldn't just say, who cares if they understand? It was important that men and women both understood. So far his words, but here in our communities, the practice is for women to go outside. So Magen Avraham is almost saying it kind of almost embarrassedly to say, yes, women should be hearing the Torah. We should be translating the Torah for women. Women need to be here. They have to be counted. But around here, they tend to go outside, right? Or even to be told to go outside in some communities. So this is where you're finding one of the examples that what is the law and what is the custom, sometimes they don't always match. Sometimes communities have customs that don't match the original feel of the law. And around the Torah reading, it's one of the places where it's most striking. Now, there are some people who argued, well, wait a minute. Maybe the reason why women don't read the Torah is because of purity, right? Because, every month, women happens, right? They become what we call Nidah. And Nidah is during the monthly cycle of a woman. They become ritually impure. Now, if you were going to the temple and you wanted to offer a sacrifice, this was a big deal, right? Because you couldn't go up to the temple during that time until you'd gone to the mikveh and had the purification. But for the Sefer Torah, for women touches the Sefer Torah or reads in the Sefer Torah, are they going to make the Torah impure, even if they're right in the middle of their nidah of that monthly period? No, it's no problem, right? It is very clear that the Torah cannot become impure, right? And even people considered ritually impure may read from it, because it's not only women that become ritually impure, right? Men can also become ritually impure. For example, if a man has the fancy word is emission, when something comes out down there that isn't at a normal time, right? A man is considered ritually impure, the same way that if something comes out from the woman at a not normal time, she's also considered ritually impure. It's called what's called being a zav. During those times, the man is ritually impure, but he can still read from the Torah. So if a man can read from the Torah when he is ritually impure, so can a woman. Why? Because as all of the authorities, Rif, Rosh, Shulchan Aruch, and Ramah, everybody agrees, based on the Talmud Brachot 22a, the Torah cannot be made ritually impure. Right? If I was a Mitzorah, usually that gets translated as someone with leprosy, right? One of the highest degrees of ritual impurity, and I touch the Torah, I'm not making the Torah, I'm not ruining the Torah. The Torah is still perfectly fine. If the Torah is in a room and someone dies, usually that makes everything ritually impure in the room, not the Torah. Now that is because of the special status of the Torah in many other ways, but the point is there is no issue with purity with regards to a woman being able to read from the Torah. Does that make sense? By the way, this is also very true when it comes to wearing tefillin. I have heard some of the people in other groups who argue that women can't wear tefillin because their bodies are not clean, are not pure. Not true. It's an interesting idea, but it has no basis in halakha. Okay. But as long as we're talking about purity, I'm going to take a couple minutes to talk about another topic that is usually treated as a woman's topic, but it isn't actually a woman's topic. It is all of our topic. And that's the topic of tzniut, or sometimes you'll hear it in the Ashkenazic, tznius, which is translated into English as meaning modesty. Now, usually what this is used to describe is that women need to wear clothes that go all the way to the floor, and sleeves that go all the way to the here, and a collar that comes all the way to the here, and a wig or a hat that covers everything on top, right? And in the old Muslim countries, women also used to wear a veil in Jewish communities as well. So, and there are some Jewish groups even today, although they're not popular or accepted, that want to wear burqas. So this usually gets translated as to some discussion of how women appear. But I want you to see how it was discussed back in the Talmud. This is Brachot 24a. So said Rabbi Isaac, an exposed handbreadth of flesh in the case of a woman is regarded as a matter of sexuality. What does that mean? So a handbreadth is this far, right? So he's saying if there's that much showing, it's sexual. Now, let's explain, what does that mean, right? In what case? Because, see, this is what happens is people read one line and then they stop. Either they stop because they disagree, or they stop because they think, yes, that's right, let's cover women in a big sack. Right? You have to read the whole discussion, right? If I say it applies to staring, right, when like somebody who is looking at the exposed piece of skin, right? Rav Sheshet taught, why did Scripture list ornaments worn outside the clothing as well as those worn inside? That's from Numbers 31. It was to tell you that whoever looks even at the little finger of a woman is as if he stared at her sexual parts. Right? So what's talking about here? He's saying that if you look with the intent to treat the woman like some sex object, then it doesn't matter how much you see. Right? She could even be dressed in a sack, and you would still be looking at her thinking, and that's the problem. How are you choosing to look at her? Because there's no amount of coverage that will prevent you from being wrong if you look at her in that way. Instead, what this is talking about is when you're talking about your own wife, right? And it pertains to the recitation of the Shema. So during the Shema in particular, you've probably noticed that people will cover their eyes or close their eyes to say the Shema. This is in order to have 100% concentration. Now, for most men, even if they are used to not looking at women as being, just woo, right, just sexy, it still can be a distraction during the time of concentration. In particular, for your own wife, with whom you can have those activities. So, how do you solve this? It's very simple. Shut your eyes during the Shema. Now I can't see a woman dressed in any way, right? If my eyes are closed.
But the thoughts still there.
And I'm responsible for my thoughts. You're not responsible for my thoughts, right? So if I'm standing in the middle of the beach and it's time for the Amidah, and I need to do the Amidah or I need to do the Shema, and there's a bunch of people walking by in bikinis, right? I don't have to put a towel over them. I just have to close my eyes and focus myself, right? Tzniut ultimately is, yes, about how we think about another person. Do we perceive them as being something that's just all about sex, or do we not? Can we look at a person and not treat them in that way? And that's what they're arguing about. They're saying even this much skin can get somebody excited, right? Even their pinky can get somebody excited if they want to get excited. And that also means if you don't want to get excited, you can control that, right? Men are not animals. I know that may be a surprise. And to pretend men have no self-control and not to ask men to have self-control for their own feelings is to miss the whole point of tzniut. Tzniut is about you looking at the world in a certain way. Because if you can't look at a woman and not think sexy thoughts, then you need a lot more work on yourself. It's not because she's dressed wrong. And then they give some examples, right? So said Rav Chisda, a woman's leg, don't go away. A woman's legs are a matter of sexuality, meaning her legs could also get you excited. How do we know this? We see in Isaiah, uncover the leg, pass through the rivers, and thereafter your nakedness shall be uncovered. Yes, your shame shall be seen, right? So yes, a leg can be attractive. Said Samuel, a woman's voice is a matter of sexuality, right? A woman, when you hear her voice, it could be, get the blood pumping. As it is said in Song of Songs, for your voice is sweet and your face pretty, right? I hear your voice and I can imagine your face. Now, this line is one that some groups have used to then say a woman should never be allowed to sing in public, right? Because if she sings in public, it's going to make men have impure thoughts. But again, it's not about her voice that's the problem. It's about the man's self-control that needs to be worked on, right? If you can't listen to somebody say a prayer with their voice, just because it's a woman voice, and all you can hear is, ooh, sexy voice, then you've got a problem, right? And the problem isn't her singing, because if she shuts up, you're still going to have those same impure thoughts. So they're trying to say that as a person, we need to be careful. We need to be alert that there are different ways to trigger our sexy thoughts, and we need to be trying to make sure we don't respond in the wrong way at the wrong time, right? With your wife, sure, no problem. But with other women or in public, then you need to be able to turn it on and turn it off. You need to be able to have that control. And the last one is also something that's of controversy in the modern world. Rav Sheshet said, a woman's hair is a matter of sexuality. As it is said, your hair is as a flock of goats, which apparently was a good thing. I don't know if I called my wife having goat hair, if she'd be happy with me, but 2,000 years ago, that was considered, very nice, for a very good compliment. So this is one reason why in many communities, women will be forced to cover their hair, because if I see your hair, my heart's going to start pounding. But again, I should be able to look at your hair and not have that problem, which is why, we don't say that only women doctors can serve women. You don't have to have a woman dentist for a female patient, right? Because men who are able to control themselves can deal with it perfectly fine, right? A male gynecologist can see a woman completely naked and just treat her like a human body that needs, a checkup. And that should be the way we can handle ourselves in any circumstance or situation. Doesn't mean that you should go around putting up giant posters of naked women on your walls. It doesn't mean that you should do your meetings at strip clubs because, hey, it's a naked woman dancing, but I can ignore it. No. But it is saying that during a regular social interaction, regular walking down the street, shopping at the mall, having a conversation at business, you should be able to interact with people of the other gender without thinking about them just as sex objects. Does it make sense? Question.
With the Orthodox woman that, I don't know if they still do, but
Mhm.
they
They shave their hair,
and
yes.
they put a wig that
Yes.
is like $1,000.
Yes?
I still cannot understand why they do that wig because it's still hair. I still look
It's
like
still
mine.
pretty.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I agree with you, but this is the way they are thinking. It's not her hair. So therefore, it's not her sexuality that is triggering the other person's thoughts. Now, I don't agree, but that's the underlying explanation, is that her hair has been cut down till it's really short. So under that wig, she's got like no hair. And therefore, nobody is seeing her hair except maybe her husband, but it's really short. And therefore, the hair that people see isn't hers. And therefore, they're not really thinking about her. They're thinking about the wig. Now, I disagree. Right? I think that if you're really worried about what people are thinking about you, putting on a pretty wig is still going to make them going va 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 voom. So it doesn't really work in my opinion. But then again, I don't think that it is the woman who needs to control what she wears. Although, of course, really a woman should not be going to work in a bikini. But it is the man who should be able to, even if she does come to work in a bikini, still treat her as just another human being rather than as someone that he is showing too much sexual excitement over. Right? If someone walks into the store and they want to buy a candy bar and they're dressed in some skimpy outfit, you should still treat them just like a customer, not like, oh, no. You should be able to control that. And if we don't ask men to control it, then they never learn. If we ask them to, then you know what? Surprisingly enough, you can. Just as an interesting aside, the rabbis made it very clear in multiple arguments throughout the rabbinic literature that a man's reaction to a woman is considered to be entirely under his control. Right? So that if a man is with a woman, he can't say, I didn't mean to. Right? Because if he didn't want to, that wouldn't have happened. Now, a lot of men nowadays say, hey, I can't control it. It just does what it wants. And that's not the way Judaism views it. Right? Judaism views it as you're in control of that. It's not in control of you. Make sense? I don't want to be more graphic. Okay. All right. Onward. Same topic, but a little more detail. He who counts out coins into a woman's hand from his own in order to have a chance to stare at her. Right? I'm sure that you've all seen people like this at the cash register in a store who are flirting with the person behind the register, who are saying, oh, let me find my credit card, but they're looking at their credit card, but really they're looking down the shirt of the woman behind, right? You've never seen this? It's okay, well, unfortunately, this kind of thing happens where people will deliberately try to have a conversation so they can check her out. Well, 2,000 years ago, people were still doing this. And the rabbi said, if that's what you're doing, right, even if such a one had in hand Torah and good deeds like Moses, even if you were righteous like Moses, you will not escape the judgment of Gehenna, right? You will be punished for what you are doing because you are deliberately objectifying and treating her in such a horrible and disrespectful way. As it says in Proverbs 11, hand to hand, he shall not escape from evil, right? If you're going from your hand to her hand just so you can keep looking and talking to her, oh, let me count out the change, rather than just, here's your money, thank you, then you are deliberately sexualizing the encounter when that's not at all what you should be doing. And just to make sure we understand that women were not considered like somebody we should ignore, just someone we shouldn't be following around lustfully. Said Rav Nachman, Manoach, that was Samson's father, was an ignorant man. For it is written, and Manoach went after his wife. He followed after his wife. Judges 13. Manoach. Yeah. So Rav Nachman Bar Isaac objected. But what about Elkanah and what about Elisha? Right, both of whom follow women. Right, Elkanah listens to Hannah when she says, I want to do this with my son, and he says, do whatever you want. And also Elisha comes after the Shunammite woman when her son dies, and he follows her back to see the boy. Right, they're following. You're going to tell me that Elkanah? You're going to tell me Elisha the prophet is an ignorant person? It is meaning that he literally went after her. He actually followed her, right? No, that's what Manoach did. For these other men, what it means is they followed her views and her counsel. It means they weren't just walking behind her so they could watch them. It meant that when they said, I think we should do this, I think we should do that they agreed. So it was okay to listen to the woman, to even agree with her opinion and even do what she said. It's just not okay to walk behind her going, wow, check that. That's not the right thing, right? Listen to, don't objectify. Make sense? Okay. When we talk about the honor of the Torah itself, we have to then explain if women, remember, boom, 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 back here when we first started talking about the gathering, if women have the obligation, if women are allowed to be counted, then why for the last 1,000 years have women not been doing this? Well, it wasn't because of tzniut, it wasn't because of purity, it was because of honor, right? All are qualified to be among the 7 who read from the Torah, even a minor and women, right? A child can read from the Torah. A woman can read from the Torah. A woman, however, is not brought to read for the public. This is from Tosefta, which is another early book of the rabbinic writings from around the time of Mishnah. And they want to know why not, right? Well, all are qualified, as we said, among the 7, even a minor, even a woman. Only the sages said that a woman may not read in the Torah because of the dignity of the community, the honor of the congregation, right? And then in Rambam, he repeated this. A woman should not read for the congregation because of the dignity of the congregation. Kavod hatzibur, the dignity of, what does that mean? The honor of the community. Don't worry, I've got an explanation. So the Ritva, one of the great commentators on the Talmud, wrote, a woman being called to the Torah reflects poorly on the congregation in the same way that a woman saying the blessing after the meals, Birkat HaMazon, on behalf of her husband, reflects poorly on him. In both instances, it appears that the congregation which is obligated, meaning that greater kind of public obligation, do not know how to perform their obligation, right? So, welcome to the fragile male ego, right? Imagine you are driving along in the car and the car breaks down, right? And the man is driving and it breaks down. He opens the hood, he's looking, he can't figure out what's wrong. And imagine someone pulls up and it's a woman. And the woman gets out and says, oh, I know what the problem is, and fixes it. Do you think there are men who would be embarrassed? Right? She knows more about cars than me? Right? Or a woman can, go to the gym and find women who can do more weightlifting than most men. Yeah. And most men are going to be like, well, yeah, I hurt my back yesterday. It's men and women, but men with women in male jobs will often feel threatened if the woman can do something that they can't. Mm-hmm. And for a large portion of our history, a large portion of our population was not great at Hebrew. And they were not great at Torah reading. So therefore, they would feel embarrassed if something that they were weak at, the woman could do better than them. Because it's like, I'm supposed to do it, but she can do it better than me. That makes me ashamed. And since that would drive them in away from the communities, it would make them resentful and angry and not want to be connected to Torah because, well, if she's doing it. The rabbi said, okay, look, yes, women can, but we're not going to, because it's causing too much trouble in these communities among the men who are unable to do the same thing, unable to read from the Torah, unable to even do Birkat HaMazon, the blessing after you eat. And so in order to protect the pride of the male population and to keep them participating in the population, the rabbi said, women, just sit down. We will take care of this, but you're embarrassing us. Does that make sense? Okay. In the modern world, in the conservative movement at least, we said, look, like tzniut, like modesty, if a man has a problem, it's his problem. Right? Because right now we have enough resources, enough ways to teach anybody who wants to how to read Hebrew and how to chant from the Torah. Right? If you want to read from the Torah and you don't even know your aleph and your bet, if you practice every day, I can have you doing that in 6 months. I've done that with Bar Mitzvah kids, right? Who show up and for whatever reason their family did not give them a good education and they show up. I can get them ready to be able to read from the Torah, at least one passage, in 6 months. No problem. If they practice every day, right? If they're willing to actually work at it. Now, in the past, we didn't always have as many resources. It wasn't always as easy to teach everyone. And people were farmers and workers that usually didn't have free time to study. And so, okay, maybe they had an excuse of why they didn't learn. Nowadays, no one has an excuse. Everybody can and everybody should. And if you don't be angry when a woman does. And don't be angry when another person does, right? If a woman says, oh, that woman's reading, but I can't read, I'm embarrassed. No, don't be embarrassed. Fix it. All right? You have free availability of many things that will help you be able to do anything Jewishly you want to do. So there is no reason to ever be embarrassed or to be angry about another person's skill. And that's one of the blessings we have in this century.
Yeah, you mentioned the Bar Mitzvah.
Uh-huh.
So adults cannot do Bar Mitzvah?
Of course adults can.
Okay, and for us in the conversion plan, do we have to do a Bar Mitzvah?
So this is we'll do this as a little bit of an aside, right? It's not the main topic, but it's a great question. So let's imagine either somebody converted as an adult, or imagine they grew up Jewish, but they never had a bar or bat mitzvah, right? They never did the ceremony. Well, technically, you become a bar or bat mitzvah when you're old enough, right? When you're 12 or 13, it happens, right? Just like your body changes when you're that age, you automatically become a bar or bat mitzvah, which means you are now obligated to keep the commandments. So if someone says, oh, well, I never had the ceremony, does that mean it's okay for me to light fires on Shabbat because I didn't have the official, like getting my driver's license? No, you still can't do it. Right? You become a person who needs to keep the commandments just by living long enough, or in the case of people who are converting, once you come out of the mikvah, once you come out of the water, it happens automatically. How you choose to celebrate being in that level, having that duty for the commandments, that is what we do with the ceremony. And that's something that you can do immediately when you turn 13. It's something you can do immediately when you turn 30 or 50 or 60 or 70. I've had people who were in their 70s who came to read for the Torah for the first time. And that was their bar mitzvah ceremony, even though they had been a bar mitzvah legally since they were 13 years old. So you do not have to do a ceremony, but once you convert, you are automatically, technically, a bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah if you're a girl. So you don't have to do the ceremony, but you do have to do the commandments. Make sense? We can talk about that more. It went saver again. We can talk about that more another time.
And then another question, the separation in the Orthodox of the woman and the men. If it's only for them to concentrate on what they're doing, and also because of the
voice.
They don't want the woman
to embarrass them.
To embarrass them.
Yes, exactly. Right. The reason why in most Orthodox communities you're going to find what's called a mechitza, a separation, is for precisely those reasons. Because the men think that if I see her, I'm going to be thinking about her. I'm not going to be thinking about my prayers. Right. Which again.
And the Muslim too.
Yeah, many other religions have the same idea. But like we showed in Judaism, at least in the original form, the man is the one who has the responsibility to control how he reacts to the presence of a woman. If you can't control yourself, you really need to work on that. Not you need to work on her. because you can never be 100% in control of the other people around you. What you can be in control of is yourself. And yes, other people shouldn't be going around flaunting, right? We don't advocate that men or women, wear tiny little Speedo bathing suits or things like that. And people shouldn't be going around, flaunting their bodies to other people and flirting sexually through their bodies. That isn't something that we encourage. But if someone happened to walk by like that, you should be able to not respond like an animal, whether you're a man or a woman. You should be able to respond as a human being, as somebody who sees another human being, not who sees a potential mate that you want to breed with, right? We're not dogs. We should be able to handle ourselves better than that. But it has become customary in many communities to have that separation, which in my mind makes it almost too easy, right? The whole point is that we are supposed to be able to elevate ourselves, not remove the temptation, right? I should be able to look at a double bacon cheeseburger and not eat it. I don't have to hide myself from double bacon cheeseburgers. I just have to say, it's food, fine, but it's not for me.
Self-control.
Right. Exactly. Self-control, right? And that is very much what many of the mitzvot try to teach for us, right? Which is, how can we make sure we make the right choices, live the right way in a world that has choices? Not, we need to remove all the bad choices so I never have to make a decision. No, I need to be able to make decisions even when they're hard decisions, right? Even when that supermodel walks by, I should still be able to look her in the eyes and ask her, what time does the train come, right? And just have a normal conversation without doing, the whole checking you out thing. But that's my job, not hers. One more thing about honor. Very interesting text this is from the Maharam of Rottenburg. He gives an interesting idea here. He says, if a city was made up completely of Kohanim, meaning all the men in the city were Kohens, it's not really technically possible, but imagine that, it was a small town and there were 12 people and they all came from the same extended family. Everybody is a Kohen. Well, Kohanim are called for the first two aliyot, right? As you know from our congregation, the first aliyah, the first person called to read or do the blessing from the Torah, is a Kohen. And the second person called is a Levi. If there is no Levi, we call another Kohen for number two, right? So the first two are Kohanim. Those are the standard aliyot we give to people who are Kohanim. But thereafter, women are called. For aliyah number 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, you would call a woman instead of another man, instead of another Kohen. For if a man is called for one of the later aliyot, which are normally given to non-Kohanim, his status as a Kohen might be impugned. People might say, wait a minute, if he's got number 4, but not number 1 or 2, does that mean he's not really a Kohen? Maybe he's not. So rather than damaging the honor of his status, you let women do it. So you can see that there is definitely an understanding that in special circumstances, even during the most traditional part of our history, people were still willing to let women come up, have an aliyah, read from the Torah, have that status. But in the modern world, pushing back against women having this kind of standing, having this equal rights, has been very much a part of what we call the counter-revolutionary movement, right? A reactionary movement. Just like after the French Revolution, just like after the American Revolution, there were people who pushed back to try and make things go back to the old way, but made the old way even stronger, right? The Counter-Reformation and the Catholic Church against Protestantism. This was an overreaction against the changes of the Enlightenment and the status and role of not only women, but also men in society. And so the idea of really pushing women all the way away and pushing them on the other side of the street so much in the European world is something that is very, very new in Judaism. In fact, if you go back and you look through the books of the sages, if you look through Rambam, if you look through the Talmud, if you look through Shulchan Aruch, nowhere in there that they say you need to build a wall between men and women. It's never discussed. It's never discussed. And if you look at the architecture, if you look at the synagogues that were built in Israel 2,000 years ago, there's no indication that there was a separation between men and women. Right? That they didn't discuss that. Right? That was just, you didn't need to have a separation. Right?
Together.
Every indication is they were together. If you look even at the old videos and pictures of the Kotel, the wall in Jerusalem from before 1967, before we had access to it, men and women are together at the Kotel. Right? There's a mixed group, and they're praying because, they, of course, are praying there. But the fact that there's a man and then a woman and then another man, that's fine. Right? It's perfectly normal. The increased separation between genders and the increased distance between genders. There are men who will no longer talk to women that aren't their wives. That is very, very modern, very, very new, and very, very unhealthy. Because if you treat every woman as sexual, then you learn to only treat women as sexual, and you increase the thoughts of sexuality in your mind. You actually build up too much of a perception of every woman as being sexy and every conversation as being sexual. And that is going the opposite direction from the way God wants us to go, right? God wants us to be able to interact freely and normally. Mm-hmm. And if you make women 100% taboo, then every conversation becomes the counting of the coins into someone else's hand. Yeah.
Okay, so in the hotel,
Mm-hmm.
they have...
Nowadays they have a separation, yes.
So since when that happened?
Since just after 1967, after Israel retook Jerusalem in the Six-Day War, the Orthodox community demanded that there be a separation. But the separation has grown since 1967 till today. So if you look at old pictures from the 60s and 70s, the wall wasn't as high, the wall didn't go back as far, it was only like nearer to where the wall itself is, but they have continued to expand and make the separation bigger and bigger and bigger.
And one thing that I experienced was that I didn't know, I went to say hi to an Orthodox, and he did like this.
Yes.
Right.
They do that all the time.
Okay.
Right. So among
I didn't know.
Right. So among the Orthodox people, they consider themselves what's called Shomer Negia, which means they are guarding against touching a woman that isn't their spouse. Right. And the idea is, if I shake hands with you, then I'm just going to get too excited, and I'll be thinking about you in a negative way. I personally believe, and there are many comments in the Talmud as well, that you should be able to look or even shake hands with a woman and not get ideas of let's go to the bedroom. Right? That you should be able to just treat them like a neutral human being.
Yes.
But that's the conservative movement, not orthodoxy.
And if you go to the Latin world, we hug and we kiss.
Yes.
It's very common.
Yes. Now I'm not much of a hugger, but I don't hug men or women. Right? For special occasions, I do, and certainly if somebody needs it, I'm happy to hug. But I'm not a big hug initiator. But yes, when I grew up, we had very dear friends in Ensenada, in Baja, California. I grew up in San Diego, and we would go down there many, many times, and families that were dear friends to my grandparents and then my mother, but they were huggers and kissers. We, a little bit less.
I just have no question, but an opinion about it, because to me that's kind of bystander in a way. Because let me tell you, if you follow an Orthodox, belief,
right?
How could you be a business person out there in the real world, and you deal with business with women? You have to shake hands.
Well, many of them will not. Many of them will not, and in fact, in places where there are large Orthodox populations that do business, certain parts of the U.S. and certain parts of Israel, that creates a big problem, because it then means that the opportunities for women to be sales representatives or to be doing business negotiations is cut back. Because if you have groups that won't talk to them or won't interact with them on an equal basis as they do with men, then that means the opportunities for women in business are severely limited. So yes, this is
I see it that way.
It's a disadvantage that comes along with this. It's not just a harmless decision. The same thing happens with regards to tzniut, with modesty. In many Orthodox newspapers, they will never print a picture of a woman. Many of them will not even print the name of the woman. So, for example, if you look at some wedding invitations, the wedding invitation will say, Mr. So-and-so is getting married to the daughter of, and then list the name of the father-in-law.
Yes.
Right? They won't list the name of the bride in the invitation.
Mhm.
Very famous photo came out when the raid on Osama bin Laden, remember during Barack Obama's presidency, and there was a very famous picture where you had the president and all of the other cabinet people watching the live information come from Pakistan as the SEAL team was making the attack. And the original picture has the whole cabinet, including, of course, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. She was in the government at that time. The picture that was printed in the Israeli newspaper, someone had erased her.
Oh, wow.
They'd photoshopped, so she wasn't there. Right? So that's a real problem. If you erase women from pictures of leadership, if you erase them from positions of public, status, then that is trying to say they don't belong there, that they're not equal in that realm. And whatever you may believe for your personal belief, right? I would never run up and if I were a woman, I would never hug an Orthodox man who didn't want to be hugged. I mean, that's his choice for himself. But there are effects of how women are treated that go beyond the personal religious choice, right? If you want to have a mechitza in your synagogue, that's fine. But if you want to erase a woman from the newspaper, if you want to change the opportunities for women in business or in politics or in medicine or in teaching as in schools, that's a problem for the whole society. And then we do need to have a long conversation. And when I mean we, I mean men and women need to talk about how this affects people outside of the religious sphere. So with that, we'll leave it there for tonight. All right.
Interesting.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yeah.
You're welcome. I will remind people, if you haven't already signed up for emails from